Right, good morning, guys. Perfect day for making pastry. It's gloomy and cold outside, so I am going to be concentrating today on shortcrust pastry. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is what I've got ready. I have my flour in a large bowl and I have my butter on the side, and I have cubed that. I've cut it up into small little bits. To stop the butter from sticking to itself, I've just simply coated it in about a tablespoon of the flour mixture that I'm going to use. Right, so I've added my butter to my flour and I'm just going to give it a mix. Now we're going to be concentrating on the rubbing in method today, guys. And really, I want to stress to you how important our hands are in any kind of baking or cooking, making bread. Our hands have got one of the most concentrated nerve endings in our fingertips. And we can feel the texture, we can feel the temperature, we can feel exactly what our food should be like. So please don't be afraid of using your hands as long as they are clean and you have scrubbed and made sure that your nails are clean underneath. Please use your hands. It is our most important tool in the kitchen. So with the rubbing in method, we are going to be mixing the flour and the fat together, and we're going to be using our fingertips, and we're going to be using this kind of motion. And with each time, we are going to push the flour and the butter together so that each particle of flour is being coated with the butter. Now, it's important to remember that everything should be cold. I actually have my flour and my butter in the fridge until I'm ready to use it, because we don't want the butter melting while we're doing the rubbing in method. We're using our fingertips because that is the coldest part of our hands, and we cut the butter up because we want it to be as quick as we can make it. If you have a food processor, you can do this bit in the food processor, which will also keep it cold. The other thing is, every time we rub, we are also going to take our fingers under and collect up anything from the bottom to make sure that we're incorporating all the flour and the fat together. Any large particles, just grab those. So we're also incorporating air into the mixture. We don't want the butter to melt, so we want it to happen really, really quickly. We want the butter to melt when we're actually baking our pastry, not at this stage. Keeping everything cold is also important because we don't want the water being absorbed, or we want to limit the amount of water being absorbed. So I'm going to explain to you what we are doing now with the rubbing in method. So as we are doing this, we are coating all the flour particles with butter. So each little flour particle ideally should have a little coating of flour, and that prevents a lot of the water being absorbed by the flour, and that limits gluten absorption, and I'm going to explain to you why that's important as we go through the video. You're going to keep doing the rubbing in method, and you're going to do it as fast as you can. Remember to keep moving it around so that you're incorporating all the butter into the flour. I'll show you what that looks like when we come back. Right, so that's what it looks like when we're finished. We have little particles of flour, butter distributed within the flour, and we want to do that as quickly as we can, guys. So as soon as it's done and most of the butter is crumbly, you stop. If you can still see bigger little bits, that's absolutely fine. It will be incorporated later in the process. Okay guys, so the reason we call it short crust pastry is because it comes apart in short irregular particles. So it's crumbly. When you bite into it, you don't want to feel as solid. You want it to crumble in your mouth, but you also want it to be strong enough to be able to do what you want it to do. So for example, to make a pie, to hold together when you lift it, you want it to crumble and break in your mouth, not while you're holding it. So it's important to balance the two functions. Now, by rubbing in and coating the fat, the flour particles with the fat, we are trying to limit the formation of gluten. Now, gluten, as we know, is the protein in flour. It is actually made up of two different proteins, glutenin and gliadin. And those two together, when we add water, form our gluten. Now, gluten is elastic. And in short crust pastry, we want to prevent the formation of that. And this is particularly important, the kind of fat that we use. Now, fat has, I use butter because I like the flavor, and it also coats all the particles. Many people have different ways of making pastry. Very often I will use a combination of butter and lard or butter and Trex, as it gives you a crumblier mixture. When you are using lard or Trex, it limits the gluten more than butter does. So please be careful when you use that. Always use it in a ratio. Don't just use lard or just use Trex. You have to sort of get a balance between that. Otherwise your pastry will be so crumbly. It will be incredibly difficult to roll out, but also break apart when you're trying to eat it. Margarine has got very high quantities of water, and I'll explain later in the video why water, we want to limit the amount of water that comes in. So the fats plays a very important role. All right, now we're going to add the water. The water also plays a very important role in the formation of gluten specifically. Now, I've kept my water cold by just adding a couple of ice cubes within the water, but you can just keep your water in the fridge, or you can just use water from the tap. And I've put it in a bowl so that it's easy for me to just scoop out and add to my pastry. Right, so I've made a well in the center of mine. I'm going to use just a round bladed knife to incorporate that water, just to start off with, because obviously if you get your fingers wet, everything's going to stick to your fingers. So just to start it off, I use a knife, and then I'll move back to my fingers again. I'm starting off with less water, and I'll add as I need, but I will feel the texture of the dough, and that's how I know that I'll need to add some more, and I'll show you a quick test for doing that as well. As soon as we start adding the water, we're going to start developing the gluten. Now, in short crust pastry, we want to limit that gluten formation. So we want to mix as little as possible, and we want to use as little water as possible to bring the pastry together. So in short crust pastry, we want to limit the formation of gluten, but in something like bread, we want to encourage the formation of gluten. So in this, we're going to keep everything that limits gluten formation. We're going to use as little water as possible. We're going to knead as little as possible, and we're going to coat everything in fat, which also limits. So there's multiple functions going on in the bowl, guys. Right, and I'm just going to start getting that incorporated with my knife, and I know I'm going to need some more. So I started off with 3, and I'm going to put in another 3 and get that mixed in. Right guys, so I ended up adding another 3.5 tablespoons of water, but please remember, everybody's using different flour and everybody's using different fat, so you're all using different combinations. Please remember that different flours absorb different amounts of water, so you cannot be specific as in you will use 6 tablespoons of water. Sometimes you will need a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, so keep an eye on your texture. When you are making your dough, feel it, so you make sure that you haven't gone too far and it's not too wet. Try not to change the ratio, because we're going to talk about ratios in a minute. Now, an easy way of testing your dough to see if it's ready is you're going to just take a little bit, squish it in your hand, and then push your thumb into it. If it crumbles and it falls apart, you're going to need some more water. If it sticks together, you're good. Right, so I'm a stickler for this. I don't like leaving anything in my bowl, so I make sure that my bowl is completely clean when I'm finished. All I did now was I squished with my hands gently just to bring all the dough together, and I've collected everything from the side of my bowl, and then we can move that and transfer that to our board so that we can, our surface, so that we can start rolling that out. Sorry guys, you can roll it out for straight away, but there is a chance of it shrinking. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to knead it just a little. I don't want to handle the dough. We are not making bread. So I just want to make sure that I've brought it together. I'm going to form it into a ball, and then I'm going to cover it in cling film, and I'm going to rest it in the fridge so that the gluten can relax. Alright guys, so I've wrapped that in some cling film and I'm going to put that into the fridge now for about 30 minutes just for the gluten to relax, and then I'll be back to show you how to roll it out. The last thing I just want to tell you about short crust pastry is that when we make different kinds of pastry, we are using when we're making short crust pastry or things like scones, rock cakes, when we're using the rubbing in method, we are trying to incorporate what is a relatively small amount of butter into a lot of flour, which is why the rubbing in method isn't actually a very good method to use for short crust pastry, along with all the other reasons. But short crust pastry has a ratio of 2 to 1, so it is always 2 parts flour to 1 part fat. So for example, if you've got 200 grams of flour, you're going to use 100 grams of fat. Whether that 100 grams be made up of a little bit of lard and a little bit of butter, or 25 grams of lard and 75 grams of butter, it is up to you and your preference as to how you like to make your short crust pastry. So in other words, if you are wanting to make pastry and you don't have a recipe and you want to make short crust, always know that if you use a ratio of 2 to 1, 2 parts flour to 1 part fat, you are going to be able to make short crust pastry. I'll see you in the next video, guys.